Good. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming on Saturday. This is the last of the formal presentations. Of course, you'll probably be glad to know, last of hearing me speak continuously. Yesterday we talked a bit about the model basic structure, but a lot of the focus was on the energy part of the modeling. This morning, going to switch over to the economy part with this last presentation. We'll get through not quite all of it before the break, but then can finish afterwards. So I'll talk about the underlying economic theory to it, which is quite different from standard mainstream economic theory. How that theory relates to the modeling, I'll go through that in quite some detail, and then advantages and disadvantages of this modeling approach. Okay. There's some pictures of some people here. See me coming from Cambridge. Our economics is in the tradition of Cambridge in the UK. And three key people in that process. First of all, going back to John Maynard Keynes. I'll have a slide about him in a minute. Although he originally went to Oxford, very much associated with Cambridge in the UK. Going back to Great Depression time and even before then. Now, going down the line after Keynes, so Richard Stone developed the national accounting system. He won the Nobel Prize in economics for that. He was not actually a student of Keynes, but worked under him at the statistical office in the UK, which is where he developed his knowledge. And the accounting system was very much formed in line with a Keynesian type economic theory. Incidentally, Richard Stone spent a year in India, I found out as well, quite early in his career, working in Madras, as it was called then, as a magistrate or something in the legal profession. But he's very much associated with Cambridge as well. He was the first director of the Department of Applied Economics at the University of Cambridge. And also the first honorary president of my company, Cambridge Econometrics, later in his life. And the guy on the right, Terry Barker, was the founder of my organisation. He was a student of Richard Stone and took forward that tradition and formalised it in the modelling, like what I've been presenting yesterday and will carry on today. So he's still around, although he's largely retired now. He remains very much involved in the work that we're doing and overseeing a lot of the modelling work. So he founded Cambridge Econometrics, my organisation, and the modelling that's all involved in that. And it goes on. I wasn't going to put a picture of me on the slide saying that I'm taking it forward, but that's the line that we have at the moment. Reaching back to the original work of Keynes. So the economics that comes from that, it's called post-Keynesian economics. Those of you not familiar, it takes the work of Keynes, which was around Great Depression time, but stretching to certainly after the Second World War and the Reconstruction efforts. But the post-Keynesian part means it's been updated for a more modern setting in the current modern economy. Particularly, that means a much more updated treatment of the financial system, which is really quite different now to how it was in the time of Keynes. So Keynes was born in Cambridge, studied in Oxford, then came back to Cambridge, Originally, he was not really an economist. Some of his earlier work was on probability theory and uncertainty, but that very much fed into his thinking about economics further down the line. And then the Great Depression really sort of, in his mind, formulated the ideas of what a modern economy should be doing and what purpose it should serve. But he was always very much focused on policy, interactions between, well, it was still called political economy back then, but politics and economics and the social aspects of the economic system. Now, of course, the general theory that Keynes wrote, it's a very well-written book, but in places it is quite difficult to interpret, and different people have interpreted it in different ways, which is why we have a whole load of different types of economics now that call themselves Keynesian. There's old Keynesian, new Keynesian, neo-Keynesian, post-Keynesian, all meaning different things because they're all different interpretations of what Keynes originally wrote. I'm talking about post-Keynesian economics, which is much truer to the original form according to its adherents. New Keynesian economics, something different entirely, which was an interpretation mainly through the US, but which has fed into the current mainstream DSGE models I mentioned yesterday, and new Keynesian in design, macroeconometric models like E3 India, post-Keynesian in design. If you want to read further into it, this is a very easy book to look at by J.E. King. It's only about that thick, so you can read it in 2 days maybe. But it gets across the basics very easily. So it's a good introduction to this type of economics. Text on the right on the slide is taken from chapter 1 of that book. It listed, and that itself is taken from a paper from 1993. 6 key features of post-Keynesian economics. So employment and unemployment are determined in the product, not labor markets. That's coming back to, well, we'll talk about this in a bit, but the demand-driven nature of the economy. Labor is not, people are not employed just for the sake of it, people are employed to produce stuff. Number 2, involuntary unemployment exists. This might seem obvious, but other economic theories do not treat unemployment this way. Okay, number 3, relationship between investment and savings is fundamental to determining output. Again, it's a demand-driven system. If we have our money, if we spend it in a shop, that's creating employment. If we don't spend it in a shop, if we save it in a bank account, that's not creating employment. No. That's the mainstream theory. That's not how it works in reality. There is not a fixed quantity of money. The money that banks lend out is leveraged. For example, it's underwritten by central banks. This is exactly what this point is saying, that there's not a fixed quantity of money in the system. Now, standards, a basic CG model would have a fixed quantity of money in the system, basically as you described. What this is saying is that the financial system is an intermediary in this that plays an important role in determining demand. It comes back to endogenous money, the theory basically.
Are we saying that saving is going into the sink and the saving has more impact on the economy other than spending money?
Yeah, I mean there are constraints, of course, in the activities of banks. but the savings go into their reserves. It's a bit like in multiplier analysis. It's treated as a leakage from the system. It doesn't contribute to demand.
I'm asking, so in this model, saving leads to the net zero impact?
Pretty much. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'll come on to that in the later slides. Okay, monetary economy is different from a barter economy. So this is the same point, really, that the amount of money is important because this is what creates the spending power that drives the economy. As the next point, again, pushing on the same issue. And then the last one, economies are driven by animal spirits. So what that means is sentiment is very important in determining levels of economic demand. So economic growth, by and large, is driven by investment. If companies are not going to invest, then the economy stagnates. If we're in a boom period of the economy when there's a lot of investment going on, this is the animal spirits, which is the quote says because it comes directly from Keynes. But if there's lots of investment going on, creating lots of demand in the economy, lots of jobs being created, then we can start to see very rapid economic growth. Of course, that will often end in a bust, which is the flip side of the equation. So that's just an introduction to some of the key principles of how the economy works. So very much the two things that come out of this that are important are money as something that drives the economy forwards, and then employment and unemployment, which links it to the more social aspects of what's going on. Okay, so that's the theory. Now, trying to link that to put that into a modeling framework is the next step. I've, over the years, tried to present various ways of doing this, and there's a logic chain that I'm going to take you through now, and this is really the starting point in that chain. So it might seem a bit abstract at this point, but bear with me on it. Okay, I already said that early in his career, Keynes was a student of probability and uncertainty. This really underpins everything that goes on inside the economics of the model. Now, Keynes defines risk and uncertainty as two quite different things. And I'm afraid the easiest way to explain it is to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld on this, that risk relates to the known unknowns, so things that we have thought about, but we don't know whether they will happen or not, whereas uncertainty relates to the unknowns, the things we haven't thought about. This is quite a key distinction. The reason for the difference is when we talk about risk, and we know what all the possibilities are, we can attach probabilities onto those, and we can make a probability distribution of the potential outcomes. That's not possible for uncertainty just because we don't know what the possible outcomes are. And if there is any uncertainty in the system on that definition, the probabilities that we attach to everything else won't add up to 1 because there's a bit missing overall. That's sort of the maths behind it for when we start to quantify in the modeling. Compared to other modeling approaches where there may be a treatment of risk or there may be an assumption of perfect knowledge, so there's no risk or uncertainty at all, this is really a key feature which guides how the model works. Okay, so you're probably thinking, how is this all relevant? Hopefully this slide starts to bring it into perspective. Okay, I said if there is uncertainty, so fundamental uncertainty, things that we just don't know will happen, to quote Keynes, we simply do not know what might happen in the future. we can't have probability distributions. That means that it's not possible to optimize overall because we don't have the necessary functions to do that. If we can't optimize, we need an alternative form of decision making in the model. And that's where the simulation term comes in. So behavior is determined by how we think people will react. And that comes from the econometrics in the model. So we're not saying optimizing behavior. We're saying instead our best guess of behavior is how people have behaved in the past. And we're going to put that into the model as an assumption for the future. Now, of course, that comes back to the Lucas critique, which I talked about yesterday, the limitations that what happened in the past may not be a very good guide to what happened in the future, but it's still our best guess overall. And what the model is doing, so there's a simulation approach, you put in your policy and then it simulates the responses to that policy. That's basically how it works. Comparing that to an optimization-based approach. Now, I often get asked the question, which one is better? Again, neither single approach is better, but they are looking at different things. The sorts of questions they are used to answer are very different. If you want to find the best way to get to an endpoint, then an optimization approach is the one to go with. And I think most of the people in this room will be very familiar with that kind of thing. But what we're looking at in the simulation approach is we want to know how people will react to a shock to the system, which could be a policy, could be change in oil prices, as we talked about yesterday. So we've got two tools doing different things. We can get quite misleading results if we use them the wrong way around. So if you use a model like E3 India to try to give an optimal outcome, it really wouldn't work because you'd have to run it an infinite number of times to try all the possibilities and then pick the best one from it. But if you use an optimization tool in a simulation context, then these assumptions about optimal behavior start to come through, and you lose the lack of knowledge that people have in the system. The two pictures on the right, just for reference, I pulled out, this is from a clip art package. I've typed in model to it, and these two things came out, just showing two completely different kinds of model there, which serve very different purposes. Optimization and simulation models, the same thing, they serve different purposes. For running a simulation model, yeah, you could run it 10 times, 20 times, and then pick out the best number. But we would never be sure that there isn't something that we haven't tried that might produce a better outcome. It's for policy analysis, I think it's just the fundamental thinking is quite different. We're not looking for the best answer, we're looking for a good answer. So start off with the policies that are feasible in a political sense and try those, and then pick the best one from that list. Does that help?
Well, that's fine, but why, are they actually, like, policy and something they're different? Are they, or that's just a way of seeing?
Yeah, I think they are quite different tools. The way they solve internally is quite different as well.
Backbone of this model is also optimization. Whatever underlying relation you have, in data you want to see whether that relation holds good or not. That you do either linear, say OLS
For the parameter estimation, that is slightly different to the modeling system. So yes, that could be optimized. So the parameters in E3 India are basically OLS produced. So you could say this, yeah. So that's optimizing in a data sense. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean that's a fair point. Yeah. No, I wouldn't say that. I think we are just talking about two different things here, and it's just we could take an example of the work that the IPCC is doing on climate change. It's say for the 2-degree scenarios, they've got a lot of optimization models, about 6 or 7 of them, that are looking at the best way to get to 2 degrees with the available technologies that are in there. Now that's quite useful as a first task, just to see whether it's feasible or not, and what sort of ballpark costs you're talking about to get there. And that's a very useful exercise, and that's been done several times now. The next stage from that is the policy questions about what policies do we need to implement to push ourselves onto that sort of path. And that's not so much an optimization question, that's a simulation question, because you want to know what happens if you put in place these individual policies. And maybe also how close you are to the optimal pathway for doing that. But it's a later stage in the process, looking at different things. So in terms of being defensive, yeah, I mean the two tools sit together, and if you applied them incorrectly, then there could be an issue. But I think it's easy just to say different rather than anything else. Okay. Right. So yes, optimization. Why is it important when we move away from this? So okay, let's read through the slides. The modeling in E3 India and E3ME, the global model, they're compared to CG models all the time, and we get asked, what is the difference in the approach? Okay, so there are lots of differences that come out, but if they almost all rely on this sort of non-optimizing going on in the model and simulation instead. So in a standard CG framework, output determined on the supply side, going back to one of the slides yesterday, because the model is finding the most efficient way of using the resources that you have available. So what determines output is the resources that you have available and any constraints on using them. In E3 India, okay, we have the resources that are available, but they're not being optimized in their use. So the level of output is determined by sort of how they're being used, how many of them are being used, and the demand to use them. So we move from a supply-based framework to a demand-based framework. And that's followed by this point at the bottom about prices in the model. So inflation being ultimate price, but prices are determined by econometric equations again, which come from relationships in the historical data, rather than moving to a automatic value that maximizes the use of resources. Yeah, so and that gets us to this last point, that it's demand driven. So what's going on in the economy is determined by the consumption, demand for final goods, the level of investment that's going on, and of course trade that's going on. Now this might come clearer on the next slide, which puts it all into an accounting framework. Right, so I'm going to spend some time on this slide because it pulls together all the previous abstract stuff and I think makes it a bit more tangible inside the model framework. Well, I mean that is a difference, but what you have described as a new Keynesian framework rather than a post-Keynesian framework. Yeah, the time to get there definitely important, but just to be clear, when we say the model is moving towards a long-run steady state, but without ever getting there, because how much detail to go into? I mean, yeah, okay. Let's stick with that. So do you go towards a long-term outcome, which would be something like moving towards an optimal position, but the time it takes to get there, other things have happened, and you never get a chance to get to that steady state. That's probably the easiest way to think about it, taking it forwards. But yeah, and it's an important point.
So that's the feedback that people are reacting.
Mm-hmm.
The engineering in that sense, when you talk about engineering versus economics, is ignore the real system. And people have their own motives, agents have their motives. When you change one thing, you try to optimize something, agent will change their behavior to frustrate your optimization.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's what you want. That is that.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, right, the accounting system. Starting in the top left, so input-output table. So this is, so in E3 India, we've got 20 different sectors. So imagine this as a 20 by 20 matrix with each of the sectors telling us which each sector buys from each other sector in its production. So in economic terms, intermediate demands, because the purchases of products to buy other products. This is really core to the system that's being run, and it's a really important data input to the model. So that's companies buying from each other. Then we move across the top row, and we see what's called the final demands. This is stuff that's bought from companies for use, consumption. And we've got households buying products, governments buying products, investment, and then trade. Again, think of all of these as vectors, 20 with the 20 sectors. So moving across the top, adding them up. Of course, yeah.
Supposing you talk about household consumption,
Mm-hmm.
talk about household consumption.
Yep.
In an optimization framework, you would have given endowments and a budget constraint and a household optimizing that would lead to consumption being a function of income.
Mm-hmm.
But in Keynesian or post-Keynesian economics, we don't go into all those micro foundations. We simply say that from behavior, as being stated, that consumption is a function of disposable income. And if you want to link it with the mainstream economics, they would say it's a function of lifetime income. Keynesians would say it's a function of current income because of maybe foreign constraints. So actually, this is a really marked difference between optimization and simulation, because optimization means the whole world is running in a nice balance, and you're continuously optimizing and you're reaching an optimum level, so you're always at the frontier. Whereas Keynesian economics means you're going by a behavioral approach, where you learn by doing. There's no as such micro foundation post-Keynesian, new Keynesians trying to bring in, but fail very miserably. So that we are once again back to the post-Keynesian framework, where you don't go by individuals optimizing markets clearly, you go by behavioral assumptions. Like Keynes didn't worry about why consumption is a function of income. That's
Yeah, absolutely. I hope everybody could hear that because it was explained much better than than I could. Thank you very much. Well, make him say it again. Right, we got to, yes, summing across the top. So we got this sum going across the top with total demand on the right, okay, correcting for imports, giving total domestic supply. Now, the big arrow coming down from top right to bottom left, this is the, again, coming back to the demand-driven nature of the model. Demand first and then supply. Companies only produce stuff that there's a demand for. That brings us down to the bottom left, and then we start to talk about the production side of the economy, supply. And these are the components of supply going up. So again, starting in the top left, the input-output table, the stuff that companies buy to produce stuff, inputs to production. But then there's also labor, of course there's the profits that companies make, otherwise they wouldn't produce the stuff in the first place. And one would hope there's also the taxes that they pay on their production. So all of these things on the production side. Now, coming back to the demand-driven nature, let's just imagine there is a shock to the system. So yesterday we looked at test scenario 1, which is an increase in investment in sector 18, I think it was. Yeah, we didn't say why there was a shock to investment. It could have been, say, foreign direct investment coming from another country, something like that. But that would have been, if we put that into this schematic, imagine that fixed investment vector there, the 18th element in it would have a higher number, well, 10% higher number than it does to begin with. So just working that around the system. So we end up, of course, the sum across the top becomes bigger. So total demand increases. Imports will knock a bit out of that, maybe, but we end up with higher domestic supply. And in terms of the sectors that the domestic supply is in, we have to do a conversion in the middle. It's not shown on the schematic, but we did a conversion from the sector making the investment, number 18, to the ones producing the investment stuff, which would be, say, construction, engineering, manufacturing, those sectors. So they would increase their supply, bringing it down to here. They've got to produce more stuff, so everything increases up this column proportionately. Go back to the input-output table. Their suppliers are going to have to produce a bit more, shift it round, and we carry on round this loop circle. Somebody asked about the Gauss-Seidel or iterative solution yesterday. Yes, I've forgotten who it was. But this is exactly what's going on here. And we go around this loop. At the moment, the model seems to be doing it 50 times every year to get to a solution. I expect it to be around 30 to 40 normally, before all these changes get too small to be worth to carrying on going around. So it's a bit like a geometric progression. Every time you go around, it's getting smaller, and eventually we know where the end point is.
All these things are function of input-output, what household final and what. Just can you tell us what is the initial state of the system and maybe one or two iterations of the system?
Yeah, so the initial state of the system is, so we're in 2018. The initial state of the system is the baseline data that we have. Then
data on all those things.
on every element here, yeah.
Year 2017, how much was household final consumption, how much government
Okay.
consumption?
Yep. Then we're putting in just this one investment shock, so changing that investment column, the vector that's there. leading to a higher sum going across the top and a higher set of numbers in that vector at the end. So that vector then gets transposed down to here, this gross output term. Now all of these things are in the production column are ratios, coefficients. So when the gross output increases, the flows associated with those also increase just by scaling upwards. So we get higher value added, higher tax payments, but back up to the input-output table, also higher inputs to production for the sectors that are producing more. And then all of those higher inputs summing across the top again, we will end up with higher numbers yet again on the right-hand side, and then work our way around the system. Does that make sense?
So year 2007, my research kit was I knew how much each household consumed, how much government consumed. Year 2018, what will determine the household consumption?
What would determine household consumption?
For each of the variables. How
Yeah.
do you compute the value of each of those boxes for 2018?
Yeah. Okay, so the example I gave, we didn't change any of the elements across the top apart from the investment one. So
suppose I don't change investment also.
Yep.
There is no external change in the system. And how will the system evolve?
yeah, so each of these things across the top, well, household consumption, investment, exports, imports, there's econometric equations attached to these, which I haven't spoken about because I was just in the accounting bit here. These are the equations you can see in the manual, and they're linked to various other points in the model, like household consumption is a function of income and inflation, things like that, which would come from this value added bit. So you could have an arrow going up there. Investment is linked to production levels, so if companies are expecting to produce more, they'll invest in more capacity. So you could have an arrow going up from there to there. These are all additional parts to the basic accounting framework, which is what's on this slide. So yeah, we are sort of building up the picture.
So all the demographics.
Where does demography come in? Comes into household consumption because the equations are per capita, so if you go back to absolute levels, it would scale up, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. The data are coming in monetary terms. So here we're talking about financial units, but this is all in a fixed price base. I was just about to come on to prices actually, because each of these things has a price attached to it as well, and those prices may change, for example, if wage rates change. But at the moment, everything is in a constant price base.
Household consumption will depend on the saving also. Instead, it will depend on the household wealth and their current year income. If I've saved in the past, I may be more now.
This is just the consumption part. Savings drop out here. So imagine you've got wages up here in the value added box. That feeds into income, and the bit of income that's spent goes into the consumption. The bit of income that's not spent comes out of the system.
But the accumulated savings will also help me consume more in the economy. In a bad time, I will save, not consume, and the economy recovers and the sentiment changes, I will consume. So here you are saying it dropped out of the system as opposed to
Yeah, it drops out into a financial balance, which we are tracking in the model. That's right. This is all in flows, of course. The stocks that come out, they are much more difficult to get data on. So we are now tracking these stocks, but and we don't have the data to bring them into the equations. But I mean, I entirely agree with what you're saying. Definitely.
He said that household consumption is function of both direct income and lifelong savings. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Because we did actually look at including wealth in the consumption equations as well, but I think I'm right in saying that we couldn't get the data to do that. So I'm looking at page 45, it's the consumption equation. So yeah, aggregate consumption in the long term is determined by just incomes, and also the interest rate is in there. With higher interest rates, more likely to save. And then there's some additional short-term effects as well, just on inflation and unemployment. Again, unemployment is a very proxy for job security. But if you're worried about job security, you're less likely to spend on large items. Okay, good. Yeah, let's bring up the three ways that GDP is calculated. So we all looked at GDP results from the model yesterday. In the National Accounting Framework, Introductory to Economics, we get taught about the three ways of calculating GDP. This is how they appear. The one that we looked at in the model is the expenditure approach, adding together the components of GDP, but we could have taken the other ones as well. Okay, now, sometimes get asked, we run scenarios, and we show positive impacts. It's like, can you just keep on spending forever, spending more and more and more, and creating higher levels of GDP? I think the question even came up yesterday. What are the limits to all of this? At the moment, okay. So what are the limits in the real world? Labor is a clear one. There's only a limited number of people that can work. Companies have limits on their capacity, how much they can produce, how much their factories can, or how much factories can produce if running at 100%. So what do we have in the model? We very clearly have the labor constraint in there. So we have a labor force, we have the employed part of it, we have the unemployed part of it, and of course there's the inactive part of the population as well. If we get to the point where the unemployed bit gets to zero, we hit full employment, that's a clear constraint on the system. You can't increase further. At the moment, we don't have the constraints on the company production side. This is, again, due to the data available length of the time series. What we would like to do is have some longer trends to project what we think capacity is, to compare actual to capacity output, and then we get a better idea of these constraints. But we need to get longer time series to work out these trends first. So this is probably something that will come in the future. But bringing it right home to the policy people, the slide I've shown many times before. The key points, okay, the first two talked about demand equals supply, and that's an accounting identity. So that is, even though the model is demand-driven, supply and demand, of course, in the model results do equal, and going round the system as we were doing ensures that is the case. But the important point is the fourth one: demand is less than or equal to potential supply, meaning that there is spare capacity in the system, which could be unemployed labor in the modeling framework. And the conclusions that bottom, policies can increase output and employment if they draw on that spare capacity.
Why this inequality of one guy can have demand more than supply also?
Demand more than supply. Well, that would be
People are demanding more than what you can produce.
unmet. Yeah, this is for a given set of prices.
That there is a different demand and consumption. Consumption is always going to be less than equal to supply. But
Yeah.
demand may be more. I mean, the system may not be able to meet my demand, therefore I will consuming less.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's a question about definitions, but yeah. I mean, demands are infinite. It's for a given set of prices.
It's not
Yeah.
infinite. For with respect to my household income, I have a certain demand pattern. System may not meet it, so I will consume less. So
Mm.
it's finite.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. This is a summary slide, really of what we've gone through, to bring back, and also picking up on some of the themes from yesterday as well. So, yeah, institutional behaviour specific to a region over a time period, that comes back to the econometric estimation. So we have separate estimates for each sector in each state, and the behaviour is determined that way. Model is demand-driven, relates back to the accounting framework with the clockwise circle going around that. A few assumptions that drop out of all of this, again relating back to optimization. Yeah, institutional rules, okay, that we hope comes into the econometric parameters because it, as long as they are consistent with the past. Imperfect competition, well, again, if we have uncertainty, so there's not perfect knowledge, and then there are lots of opportunities for companies to exploit gaps in the knowledge. And variable returns to scale, again, also coming through the estimation, but we see from the parameters that that's quite clear. The demand-driven system, ultimately, we always come back to consumers' demand, what households want to consume. The economy is geared towards producing those goods. Okay, maybe government as well, where government is providing the services, but ultimately for the consumption by individuals. And the whole system and the way of producing stuff, of both labor, investment, and the other factors of production, they're being used in a way that companies are trying to produce that stuff to meet the demands of the consumers as best as possible. We're due to break at 11. Is that right? Okay, so one slide and before we stop. Again, something that we're asked a lot in the modelling. What are the input assumptions going forward, the exogenous values? The main exogenous things going into the model are the historical data, which we hope are correct, accurate, and fixed. They don't change. And that determines the behavioral parameters. It determines some of the trends in the model as well. But looking forwards, these are some of the things that are in the assumptions files that some of you looked at yesterday that you can put values in for. These are things that the model doesn't attempt to calculate. So population, that's specifically birth rates and death rates are given by assumption. The total population of India is also fixed, but there is some allowance for migration between the states and the model. Natural resource prices, these are set on global markets generally, so they're given as fixed because they fall outside the scope model for India. Government rates of expenditure, we haven't tried to model these just because they come through a political process rather than an economic process, so they're given by assumption as well, and you can enter the values that you want. Same for tax rates there. Exchange rates and interest rates. This is out of date now, this slide, because these are now given endogenously in the model. There are equations to do so. If you wanted to test a scenario where the exchange rate or the interest rates change, though, you could do that by making it exogenous again. Yeah, and then the last 2 points, again, things going on outside India, they fall outside the scope of the model, so we need to make assumptions about that, but they're available in the assumptions files to put in the values that you want, if you want to test that. Okay, so if we stop there for the coffee break, after the break, I'll just do an example of some multipliers coming out of the model, which might help to explain things a bit further. And then we'll finish off this session with maybe 5 or 6 more slides and get back to the practical stuff. Okay?
The second bullet, natural resources, coal, oil, is that you're looking at the price or the availability of it?
It's if we're talking about global level, it would be the availability, but when we're just talking about India, it's probably the price that comes from that availability. This was a slide that was up yesterday in the afternoon, looking at interpreting some of the results from the test scenario. We had just before the break the slide that showed the national accounting framework and the loop and the clockwise circle going around that loop. This is, again, which we looked at yesterday, really showing something very similar, but it does have some of the other linkages that were raised in the questions, actually, that can be added on to that loop. So on the national accounting diagram, we just had one big circle going around the whole thing, but here we've got 3 different loops that are built into the system, and these are all examples of positive feedback effects that we get in the modeling. So let's take them one at a time, starting with the blue loop, which does come back to the previous discussion. The income loop, it's called, so on the right-hand side. So again, starting with output, total supply. So more stuff produced, more jobs leading to higher incomes, and then through to expenditure, back to demand, sort of multiplier effect there, just through the household income part of the model. Now, of course, some of these things are in different units. Employment is measured in thousands rather than a monetary term, but we do have average wage rates attached to that to get things back to money terms. It's to say these things are not all equal, so incomes doesn't automatically lead to expenditure, as was discussed before the break. That's loop number 1. The second loop is the one I think we probably talked about the most yesterday, the investment loop, because that was the test scenario number 1 that we looked at. Much smaller on the diagram, the pink one. So again, starting with output, if companies think there is a potential to make more profits, they will invest in more capacity. That investment creates demand for the companies that produce the investment goods, like construction. Of course, that feeds back to output, and then they may want to invest more as well. We go around that loop. That's the second one. The third loop is the trade one, the yellow one around here, and this is the linkages between the different states in India. So if one state is doing very well, it might import more from a neighboring state, which then has secondary effects, and we go around that loop. Again, this is all in mainly in money terms, but in a constant price space. There are some little indicators on the diagram that show where price effects also come in, and also that's the dollar sign, but also it's meant to be a lightning bolt where technology comes in and influences the relationships. So if that's sort of expanded and slightly more pretty version of the loops, this slide then sort of gives a practical example of it with some numbers, a very simplified representation where instead of having 20 sectors, we've got 3, and showing how a multiplier is calculated through the system. The slide builds up through an animation. Okay, so think back to yesterday, test scenario 1, we had an increase, we started with an increase in investment in the other business services sector. This example, an $100 increase in manufacturing demand. Again, it could be, say, for export or could be foreign direct investment, whatever reason. So $100 boost to manufacturing. If you look at the table on the top right, I hope it's visible from the back, and go down that column, you see that for every 1 unit of production by manufacturing, it needs to purchase 0.1 units of agricultural goods, 0.3 units from other manufacturing companies, and 0.2 for services. So multiplying that by the 100, you can see that you make that initial injection and you get bonuses of $10 for agriculture, 30 for manufacturing, and 20 for services. So already we've got more than $100 in the system. That is sort of maybe one loop around the accounting framework. Of course, we do that again. Just take the agricultural numbers here. So we've got a $10 boost to agriculture. Look at the agriculture column in the top right. You see 0.2, 0.2, 0.1 moving down that column. So that $10 translates to $2, $2, and $1 for the 3 sectors in the economy. Same for the other ones. We get this boost. If you really want to follow this through, you start to go to the next round and exactly just doing the same calculation again, multiplying matrices together. And you can see the numbers keep adding up, but they're also getting smaller and smaller, the differences as we go down round this loop. And eventually, they get so small that they are insignificant and we can ignore them. And this is the totals that come out at the end. So that's where the multiplier comes from. So what we end up with is, I haven't checked this, $100 going in and $120 coming out. That's excluding the initial $100. So add those things together, you get a total of $220 extra production just from that initial $100 going in. And take that ratio, 220 divided by 100, 2.2, that's the multiplier. That's that. That's just doing a matrix calculation. It's not related to the model at all, but all of this happens inside the modeling framework, just with 20 sectors instead of 3 in each state, and with some of the other things going on as well, the other loops that were shown. So here we're just talking about companies buying from each other, but also $100 more manufacturing production, there'd be more jobs created as well, so we'd have the income effect, and same with the investment. All of these things happening together inside the modeling framework. Okay, any questions on that before I move on? Now, something I get asked about a lot in the modeling is the treatment of the labor market, partly because of the model results. The stuff that gets the most focus is often jobs. What does this policy mean for jobs? What does this policy mean for unemployment? So I have a slide on this. First, I think the most important point is that something I said earlier, employment only happens because companies need stuff produced and they need people to produce it. So there's no employment just for the sake of it. Wage rates are determined at market level, but they and then companies will employ people at the market wage rates. Wage rates can get pushed up and down, of course, by demand and supply in the system. The econometric equations can be quite complicated for wages, but we do see them moving up and down depending on where we are in the economic cycle. So that gives us wage demand. There's also an equation for the supply of labour. So population is generally fixed, but the share of the population participating in the labour market is something that is modelled, and in the manual you'll see the equation to do that. Generally, if the economy is growing quickly, more people will look to work. If unemployment rates are low, more people will look to work. These are all terms put into the econometric equations to see how important they are. How do we get to unemployment? This is a more straightforward relationship. Okay, if we've got labour supply, the process I just described, population times participation rates. We've got labour demand, which is employment at a given wage rate. Then the unemployment is just the wedge between those two numbers. Of course, it has to be positive, it can't be negative. Otherwise, we'd be employing more people than are available. That's the capacity constraint. But unemployment comes out as a difference between those two numbers. Now, as is often the case, when you have a number that's the difference between two large numbers, it can be very sensitive. So a relatively small change in employment and labour demand can lead to quite a large relative change in unemployment. But this is also an area where, as we were building the model, we were realizing from the data that there's very specific context to India here, particularly relating to the informal economy, and that low unemployment rates often just mean that more people are dropping out of the formal, well, there are less people in the formal workforce, which, again, as we had discussions about last week, is something that by definition we can't measure, but we do need to somehow try to account for in the modelling methodology. Prices, so another diagram, a bit like the one for output, but where the one for output was all in a constant price base. This is talking about how prices get determined in the modelling framework. It's a mixture of accounting relationships and econometric equations. Where to start on this? Probably the most important part of the modelling to be aware of is this loop on the right-hand side. So we've got industrial prices right in the middle. This is the core of the prices in the model. So it's the prices of stuff being produced in each sector within each state in India. Following that up diagonally to the right to consumer prices, that gets you to the consumer price deflator, so the measure of inflation in the economy. That's not an econometric relationship, that's an accounting relationship, because the inflation is determined by what people buy and the prices of the stuff that they buy. That's an accounting relationship. But then coming down, average earnings, wages. This is something that's pretty critical in determining what happens in the economy. Because going back to the labour market bit on the last slide, the wages are determining the level of employment, so really important here. But the link from inflation to wages is what determines real incomes in the model. So going back to the discussion about household consumption, which is based on real incomes, then what's happening to wages in relation to prices is absolutely critical here. Leaving aside the household bit for a minute, thinking about businesses, if labour costs increase, their wage rates increase, unit labor costs increase. So key measure of business competitiveness, higher wages, higher unit labor costs. And these companies will be doing as much as they can to pass on these higher costs in the form of higher prices back to the industrial prices bit in the middle. So we've got a loop here. How much of the additional cost they can pass on really depends on how competitive their market is. If a firm is a monopoly, it can charge whatever prices it wants, then we might see one behavior. If a firm is in a highly competitive industry, then it may not be able to pass on any cost increases at all. That circle there, you sometimes hear inflationary spirals in the media. That would be what it is, basically, that loop there, a very strong positive feedback effect. Higher prices leading to higher wage rates leading to higher prices, and you go around that circle. Typically, when an economy is overheating in a booming situation, this is a sort of thing we start to see. Okay, the other bits of the diagram, okay, we've got trade down the middle. Of course, fairly obviously, the cost of producing stuff in India feeds into the export prices. Similarly, import prices feed into the cost of producing stuff in India. So imagine a higher oil price, that will affect the cost of production for companies that use oil in India. This unit material costs variable, that's sort of parallel to the unit labor cost. The two things get added together to give a total cost of production. The other bits here, so the yellow and the blue bits. The yellow bits are exogenous, so these are defined by the user, their assumptions, and this is stuff that's happening outside of India. By exchange rates there, I mean not the rupee Indian exchange rate, but exchange rates in the rest of the world. And then the blue bit is what's happening in all the other states in India. So if prices are going up in one state and the goods they're exporting are more expensive, that means that the states that are buying it are buying more expensive stuff. So inflation can spread throughout the country through these trade relationships. Any questions on that? Okay. Shifting sideways a bit to the econometrics now. As I've already told some of you, I'm not an econometrician, so I don't want detailed questions about the econometrics. But there is a bit of information in the manual on this and references. The most important thing to take out of it is the model mixes accounting stuff and the behavioral relationships. The behavioral relationships come from the econometrics, the elasticities. There's a summary list of them there, but there's a lot more detail in the manual on that. The econometric method that's used is based on OLS regression in its most basic form. It's a two-stage regression that's carried out. One stage to estimate long-term relationships, and another stage to estimate short-term, year-to-year transition type effects. Question I always get from that is, how long is the long-term, how many years? And that also comes from the econometric estimation as well. So what comes out of the equations is short-term effects, long-term effects, and the speed it takes, the length of time it takes to get to the long-term. For the people that do econometrics here, it's an error correction methodology. It does that using instrumental variables to account for endogeneity in the system. But if you want to find out more information on that, the manual is the place to look. I've also been asked a lot about how the model has been validated in the past. This is something that we have put a lot of work into. There is quite a lengthy section on the manual on this as well. But essentially what we've done is, okay, well let's start more basically. The individual econometric equations, we can get statistics out of those to say how well the equations match the data. Even basic stuff like R-squared indicators are helpful for this. So all those individual equations we can do formal testing on as a validation, and really if those tests are all passed, we don't need to go any further than that. We know we're matching the data quite well. The more difficult bit is when you put all those equations together inside the single system. How do we know that the model is replicating what's going on in the economy well enough? Because going back to the earlier slides, we say it's a simulation model, so it's trying to simulate what happens in the real world. How well is it doing that? So what we did was we went back to the historical data. We ran the model over the historical period. Now, when you were running the test scenarios, you were also running the model over the historical period, but it was in the up to the last year of data, it was fixed to match the data. What we did was we took out that constraint and just let the model produce whatever it did from the equations, and then compared that to the actual data to see how well it matched. There's lots of charts in the manual showing it. Essentially, well, this is an example for GDP for India as a whole. The blue line is what came out of the model. The orange line was the actual data. I don't know how clear the units on the left-hand side are, but we're talking about trillions of rupees here, and the scale's been exaggerated. It starts at 28 and finishes at 50-something, 55. So it's been expanded as much as possible. Even so, because the data is not matching perfectly, because there are errors in the estimation equations. We don't have R-squared of 100% in our econometric estimates. That would be silly. So of course there are some errors there, but the model's generally tracking quite well, and the difference between those two lines, I think it's about 1% overall. So we were quite pleasantly surprised to see just how well the model was matching against the actual data. Now, in the manual, there's lots more charts. They go down to state level as well. We can see that for some of the states, the errors do become bigger. As you would expect, the higher the level of detail, the greater the potential errors in the system, particularly when there are questions about some of the data that we're using. So the conclusions that we took from it is, okay, well, first of all, the system is set up as it should be. There's no major errors in implementation. But while we always need to be aware of the accuracy and the degree of uncertainty in the modeling that we're doing, we do seem to be tracking the data reasonably well that's coming out. And I think, well, I would say if this was a validation test, then we have got there. So just to finish off with, again, another question that often came up, which I said at the beginning of this presentation. What is the difference between E3 India and a CGE model? Now, not all CGE models are the same, so we do have to generalize a bit here. This is a slide that sort of shows the advantages of E3 India with relaxing some of the assumptions compared to a standard CGE model. The next slide will show the limitations. But yeah, do be aware that there are lots of CGE models that do relax some of these assumptions as well and improve on the treatments. So it's very much just a comparison to the most simple approach. But yeah, a whole load of stuff that comes out. I think I talked about all of it already. So keep that for reference, but probably more important, the limitations of E3 India. Lots of them come up in discussion already. We don't ever want to say that the model is perfect or it's the only tool that should be used. It is one tool amongst many, each of which has its advantages and disadvantages. But the limitations can come down to these four categories, in my view. Number one, data. Of course, inevitably we get on to discussions about data. As an econometric model, where the behavioral parameters are determined by the data, it's even more important than in other modeling approaches. Quality and availability of data. Well, we know there are gaps in the data, particularly for some of the interactions between states and interactions between industries within states. There's not much we can do about it at this time. Anybody wants to put pressure on the statistical authorities to produce more data, then great. But right now we have to work with what we have. The econometric approach, often looked upon as an advantage, but it does have its limitations as well. Take them together, dealing with structural change and how things might change in the future. The econometrics tell us the behavior in the past. When we project forward, we are assuming that that behavior will stay the same. Of course, if we put in certain policies, it might change. Talked about this in the first presentation yesterday, but it is important. We can't forget about it. Complexity, complex linkages between different parts of the model, the possibility that small errors could be multiplied in the results. Remember yesterday in the energy session I talked about path dependency, how doing something quite small in an early year might lead to quite a big outcome in a later year. In the same way that the policy effects are magnified, any errors that are put in could be magnified as well. We do need to be careful about this, and it comes back to the uncertainty in the results. And then the last one, treatment of financial markets. Okay, so this is somewhere where we've been improving the treatment of the model recently and to look at financial balances, but we do need to be clear that even though the model solves from year to year, it's not going to predict a financial crisis or something like that. That's not what it's designed for. What happens in financial markets is, as far as I can see, completely unpredictable, and even the people that work in financial markets are very limited with the tools they have. We're not trying to answer that sort of question with the model. And the last slide, again, just for you guys who are thinking about how to use the model for your own work. I've grayed out the energy ones because I think we talked about those yesterday. But possibilities for non-energy related applications of the model, if they are useful for your own research. Fiscal policy, government revenues and spending, so yeah, what's going on the fiscal side of things. Monetary policies, trade agreements, making adjustments to trade prices. Framework does allow for that. Labor, supply and demand, I wouldn't say forecast, but projections. Because the model has a relatively detailed treatment of the labor market, then this is something that's available. We do quite a lot of work in Europe using a European model that with the same setup to do this. Yeah, and then the last one, improving female participation rates. There's been quite a big policy push in many countries in this direction recently. What happens if the labor supply increases, the available pool of workers increases? How does that impact on economic activity? Okay, and then on the right-hand side, just some other possible examples looking at particular areas. If these are of interest to you, then I'm going to, when we come around in the practical sessions, just say, what can we do to look at these things? I've got some ideas. Is it possible to model them? For the rest of the day, it's the sort of discussions that I think we're going to be having in the session. And okay, that's it. Before we get back to the practical stuff, there's going to be some demonstrations. But are there any questions on the slides from either before or after the break that you want to go through? Sorry? Yeah, the current version is 20 sectors. Now, the main limitation there at the moment is that manufacturing is a single sector, because that was the data that we were working with. We're hoping to, over the summer, expand manufacturing to bring in another 10 to 20 sectors in total. It's quite a big task to bring that into the model, but it's feedback that we keep getting. We need more detail. Exactly, yeah. And this also relates to one of the other data limitations, which is input-output tables at state level, because at the moment we're just using a national input-output table for all the states because we don't have the data at state level. When we have manufacturing as a single sector there, of course, because of the different compositions within each state, that is pretty inaccurate, I think. But if we can break down manufacturing details, then the sectors might be a bit more homogeneous between states, which would improve the accuracy. Of course, it's not going to be as good as having state-level data, but it does go some way to addressing that issue. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. It's something that we've had in mind all the time while we've been developing the model. It partly depends on what's in the data and what's not in the data, which isn't always clear to me, to be honest. But I would say this is somewhere where we're looking for feedback from people using the model and the limitations, because I don't think we're there yet on this. I think there are improvements to be done.